I want to begin by suggesting that Christian discipleship is more than just making a decision that applies to the spiritual aspect of our lives and focusing on that area only. I want to assert that Christian discipleship is a lifestyle. It is a commitment, a decision that applies to all areas of our lives. It influences every aspect of our lives. Our discipleship is not only to be evidenced in our church life and in our interactions with brothers and sisters of the faith, but it is to be seen, lived, and experienced in every single area of our lives. It becomes our identity, our character, and our very nature. It's not like clothes that we put on and take off, depending on external conditions or according to our internal disposition or the occasions that we are attending. To be a Christian, to be a disciple, and so are many of you, is a choice you make. It is a position you take. It is a decision you arrive at, but there are fundamental differences between choosing to become a disciple of the Lord and having it intersect with every other choice we make, every other position we take, and every discussion we entertain. You see, Christian discipleship involves and implies permanence. It is something that once we are, it implies that we will always be. We are never a disciple today and not a disciple tomorrow. It implies permanence. Christian discipleship influences the choices we make, the positions we take, and the decisions, the conclusions we arrive at. Christian discipleship is not situational or circumstantial. By that I mean, it is not the situation or the circumstances that determine if we should express our discipleship to the Lord. Rather, it is our discipleship to the Lord, the God we serve, that influences our actions and responses to the external environment in which we find ourselves. It is not the external that defines us. It is the internal that determines our outlook, our perspective on the external. I want to suggest too that Christian discipleship has because it has that consistency component, it becomes dangerous. Because our response to the external environment are predictable. You are a disciple of Christ in God. And because of this allegiance, this commitment, this devotion, your responses to what is happening around you carries an element of predictability, because your responses are fashioned and crafted by the manual of your life, which is called the Bible. And that manual for living, that manual is available to you, but not only to you. It is available to everyone even to those who do not like you and have it in for you and want to see your destruction and even your demise. We are who we are. Daniel was who he was, and because of his commitment to God, those who were his detractors, those who despised him, those who wanted to do him in, realized that they could, because his reactions are so predictable. All they had to do was find a way around it, and they had him. Daniel is the subject for our reflection. And I want to suggest that in this 6th chapter of the book, named after him, it provides insight and inspiration for those of us who seek to live as contemporary disciples in an increasingly hostile to God environment. But there are few lessons from Daniel in general and from this 6th chapter in particular that I want to share with you this morning. The first lesson is this: you are who you are, irrespective of where you are. You are who you are, irrespective of where you are. The book of Daniel and the central character in the book is located in a country far away from home. He, along with many of his countrymen, had been forcibly removed from his homeland and exiled to Babylon without any assurance of ever being allowed to return home. The Persian Empire is the superpower of the day and dominated all lesser powers. Consistent with the nature and practice of superpowers, it operated as an oppressive, corrupt, exploitative power, dominating and destroying all who oppose them. They enforced their iron will upon those they captured and dished out death generously to those who were rebellious or even resisted their will. The Babylonians initially had overrun and destroyed Jerusalem and its temple, taken away its people, robbed the things of God, and dedicated them to the idols they served. And if the savagery of Nebuchadnezzar was not enough, there was the sacrilege of Belshazzar, who desecrated God's sacred vessels, believing himself to be above and beyond any power, celestial or terrestrial. God intervened, judged Belshazzar and Babylon, and overthrew them using the latest superpower, Medo-Persia. Daniel was no mere onlooker in this unfolding panorama of the rise and fall of superpowers. He was a co-opted participant. He was smack in the midst of it all. And where was God in all of this? God was with Daniel. God was with his people. God had gone with them into Babylon. And when Medo-Persia overthrew Babylon, God was still there with his people. You will remember that Daniel and his companions were faithful to God when they were uprooted from Judah, from Jerusalem, and transported to Babylon. They were selected for senior positions in the Babylonian civil service, but had refused to eat the menu provided on the basis that to do so would be to show disloyalty to God. And that was not an option. Here they were, young men, uprooted and exiled from their own country. Their country was dominated, it was destroyed. Their sacred temple had been destroyed. But they were selected for special preparation. So, of all those who had been dislocated and relocated, they were among the privileged because they were given special treatment. They ate the food that was consistent with what the king himself ate. But powerless as they were, overpowered as they were by the circumstances in which they found themselves, they refused to eat the food, saying that to do so would show disloyalty to their God. But where was their God? Their country had been destroyed, their temple had been destroyed. That did not shake their faith. They stood firmly in their conviction. Their caretaker, the steward assigned to them, was in a total state of quandary. They could be killed, they could be imprisoned, but they could not be forced to eat. The poor steward pleaded with them. Hear their response. Give us vegetable and water. That's enough. But how can you survive on that? Give us that. It will be enough. God honored their faithfulness. God honored their commitment to him, for they fared better in every way compared to their counterparts who ate the food that was previously offered to the false gods of Babylon. Later, you'll recall when Nebuchadnezzar created his monumental idol of gold and commanded everyone to pay homage to it. The Hebrew boys refused and were subsequently thrown into the fire. Again, God showed up and delivered them. Are there any lessons to be learned from the experiences of Daniel and his friends as they lived and survived and prospered in an unfriendly and hostile environment? Is there any lesson to be learned from these people of God as they sought to be faithful to God, to be obedient to God, and to follow God, even in a hostile and unaccommodating environment? If there is one lesson, I believe it is this: you are who you are, irrespective of where you are. It is not the circumstances that determine who you are. It is who you are that determines your response to the circumstances. Location, company, and circumstances are not acceptable excuses for negatively influencing or adjusting our discipleship. Your conduct and your responses to the hostile environment in which you find yourselves must be conditioned by the very manual for life, which is the Bible. You are disciples of Christ. You are God's people. You are citizens of heaven. The external environment may be daunting, threatening, intimidating, but you are still Christ's disciples. And just as he had set his face steadfastly towards Jerusalem, knowing full well that suffering, rejection, and death awaited him there, so must be your determination as his disciples, his ambassadors, his people, even in the midst of an unfriendly and hostile environment. The circumstances may change, the challenges may differ, and the location may be different. But Daniel teaches us that whatever may be the circumstances in which you find yourself, you are still a disciple of the Lord. You are a servant of God. You are who you are, irrespective of where you are. But can I suggest that there is a second lesson to be learned from this passage in Daniel chapter 6? You are who you are, irrespective of where you are. Can I also suggest to you, my brothers and sisters, that your discipleship informs your disciplines, your habits, and your values. Your discipleship informs your disciplines, your habits, and your values. Discipleship, brothers and sisters, is not about convenience or pretense. It is about essence. Discipleship is not about convenience or pretense. It is about essence. Daniel is located in the midst of the most powerful foreign power of its time. He's an exile from his native land. He did not choose to go to Babylon, no Persia, for refuge. Rather, he was forcibly dislocated from his native land and exported there at the pleasure of the Babylonians, who were later overthrown by the Persians. Though he and those like him were overwhelmingly outnumbered by those among whom he lived and worked, they were never overwhelmed. They were overwhelmingly outnumbered, but they were never overwhelmed. Daniel had to work and associate with those persons who were different from him, within a structure that was unfriendly and unaccommodating to his godly traditions and practices. He was a foreigner in a foreign land among a foreign people, serving with them with foreign culture, in a foreign culture, with foreign traditions. But he was who he was. His ethics, his discipline, his habits, and his values distinguished him and separated him from everyone else. This is a big challenge, because the truth is, many of us do not want to be different. We want to blend in. We want to be assimilated. We want to be a part of. This was Israel's problem. God said to Israel, I have chosen you to be different from all the nations around you. And the people of Israel said, we don't want to be different. We want to be like them. So give us a king like everybody else. And God said, but you already have a king, me. He said, no, we want one who we can see, like everybody else. And even today, there are so many of us who want to be a part of, not to be separated from, not to be different from, but we want to be a part of the group, a part of the happening, a part of where it's at. We don't want to be singled out as different. Daniel was different from everybody else. Not because he looked different, but because of who he was. You know, the passage tells us that there were 120 governors appointed by the king, basically to manage the affairs of the vast empire. Daniel was among the 120. Then the king further whittled it down. And he said he wanted 3 of them, the best and the brightest, to report to him. And by so doing, he would, instead of having to consult with 120, he wanted 3, a manageable number. So 3 were appointed by the king. Daniel was one of them. But then the king said, listen, I want one who would be essentially second to me. And he would have administrative responsibility for the entire empire. And this is where the going got rough. Because what that meant was not that the 2 lieutenant governors would now report to Daniel. It meant that everybody else would have to report to Daniel. Daniel was answerable only to the king. So there was a king, Daniel, and everybody else. But Daniel never born here. Daniel never come from here. I have to be careful now. Daniel had a different accent. Somebody opened the door and I walked through it. Daniel was different. Now, how could this foreigner, this person who was a captive, taken because they could not withstand us, how could he then become head over all of us? There's something incongruous about that. This was difficult. The subjugated becomes the sovereign. Isn't that, you read something about that with Joseph. Exile, slave, becoming sovereign. Who is Daniel? Daniel is an immigrant, an Israelite, a member of a despised, subjugated people group, a foreigner and a stranger among them. Though he was a minority among them, his character made him stand out from them. You know what? When you read the passage carefully and you read the 4th verse, in one translation, it says Daniel was reliable. He did not do anything wrong. He was not dishonest. When it comes to Daniel, his character as a committed servant, not just of the power that be, but as a servant of God, brought him to the fore. In fact, the people said, his detractors said, when it comes to him, This is what they are saying, you know. Let's face it, fellows. Let's face it. Daniel is reliable. He not do nothing wrong. He's not dishonest. His morality, his ethics are above scrutiny. The man is an outstanding fellow, guys, let's face it. But Daniel does have an Achilles heel. He has a weakness. He was a man love worship. Faithful to his God. The only way we can find a fault against Daniel is if we can find it against his God. He was a godly man, and his commitment was demonstrated in his work, his conduct, his performance, and his character. The only way to find a fault against him is to do it in relation to his God. Brothers and sisters, I want to suggest to you that it is our discipleship should inform our disciplines, our habits, and our values. As disciples of the Lord, we are called upon to demonstrate the same kind of virtues in our work, in our relationship, in our lives that Daniel demonstrated while an exile in a land that was foreign to him. The truth is, too many of us have exposed ourselves to following the group, and in so doing, we follow the bad habits of the group. We follow the bad habits of everybody else. You know, you have some Christians who don't work for themselves and tell us, boy, I don't know, I always come late. And say it as a kind of badge of honor. That is just how I am. They put their jobs at risk. And when disciplinary action is taken against them, they come and complain that they are being persecuted. Though not necessarily for righteousness' sake, but they are being persecuted. And it's because they don't like them. Brothers and sisters, Daniel's detractors could find nothing wrong with him. In fact, can I suggest to you that when they said, we can find nothing wrong with him except in relation to his God, they were unwittingly paying Daniel the highest compliment that they could ever have done. His work is fine, A+. His attitude, his values, A+, A+. But he has one weakness. The man loved God too much. The man worshiped God too much. But the worship did not detract from his performance. You have some of us love to worship. Spend all our time in worship, even work time. Stay late at church, not at this church, but stay late at church, and next morning can't wake up. Brothers and sisters, you know, the sad thing about it is that there are so many of us who have exposed ourselves, who have allowed ourselves to be so influenced by the alluring appeals of the environment that we have embraced the seductive allures of the world and the environment in which we live. And in so doing, we have allowed our faith to become shipwrecked. Be assured that no matter the adverse circumstances and challenges that may come upon you, no matter the pressure meted out to you, no matter the adverse comments that may be made about you, a disciplined, determined, and intentional commitment to discipleship must inform your disciplines, your habits, and your values, and it will serve you well. It may not always be easy, but it will serve you well ultimately. Read the book of Daniel again. Challenges all around him. Hostility all around him. but he was faithful in his commitment to God. Never wavered. He stood alone, but God was with him. You are who you are, irrespective of where you are. Your discipleship informs your disciplines, your habits, and your values. What kind of values are we cultivating? What kind of disciplines are we known for? What kind of habits can anybody know who knows us tell us about ourselves? What are our godly disciplines, our godly habits, and our godly values that mark and characterize our lives? I make a third and final point. And it is this: even at the risk of threat or survival, your discipleship is never a matter for negotiation or compromise. Even at the risk of threat or survival, your discipleship is never a matter for negotiation or compromise. To get rid of Daniel, and these guys were serious. It's not a matter of trying to depose Daniel. It's really a matter of getting rid of him. He was in a hostile environment. They came up with a plot, a masterpiece of a plot, which would serve two purposes. One, it would stroke the king's ego. It would so sweet the king. It would play on his ego. And secondly, it would serve the purpose of getting rid of Daniel once and for all. The plot was simple. Get the king to sign a decree prohibiting anyone and everyone for making up an appeal to any deity or person, except the king, for a period of 30 days. Punishment for breaking this edict would be to be thrown into a den of hungry lions. What a masterpiece of a plot. And it doesn't even seem as if they had any trouble convincing the king to sign off on it. The narcissist that he was. And you know, power has that, power does that. Power causes us to think we are better than we are. Power speaks of promotion, elevation. And even with the most godly of us, if you're not careful, when people start to talk nice about you and big you up and exalt you, you sort of reach a place where you believe that you earn it, you deserve it, and it's true. One of the temptations that we have, people come to you and say, boy, man, that was a wonderful sermon, a great sermon. My shop, you believe it. People come to you and say, man, you are the best. What a brilliant man. And you are God's gift to us. You're not careful, yes, I believe it. Because it sounds good. And the only time people don't like good things being said is when it is being said about somebody else. All of us like to hear nice things being said about us. Even if it's not true, it still sounds good. People can't say, boy, I know you're a busy person. Mark, you're good for a play solitaire, but as far as you're a busy man. And it sort of sounds good, and say, okay, what can I do for you? It strokes your ego. They go to the king and say, man, king, it's not that they can't ask anything, but they have to ask you. Not even God they can ask, they must ask you. The king had no difficulty in signing off on it. And the guys reminded him, King, remember, once you have fixed your signature to it, it now becomes the law of the Medes and the Persians. It cannot be changed, not even by you. But the king don't have no problem with that. After all, it's him, they're going to have to come to anywhere. So it's win-win all the way around. And this was broadcast far and wide to every corner of the Persian Empire. The wicked conspirators. And notice, brothers and sisters, the wickedness wasn't from the king. It was from Daniel's colleagues. It's not the head man do it. It is the people with whom Daniel lived and worked. And the problem with many of us is that we believe everybody is our friend. Because everybody is nice to us. And we think is the big man or the... Let me not be sexist in my... It's not the big person on top. I have to be gender neutral. I don't want my sexism to come to the fore. It's not the big person on top who is the oppressor. Who is always the enemy. Many a times the enemy is from among us. Be careful. So they devised this, and it is now published. They had won, and Daniel was now the target. But notice the genius of the plan. It does not affect Daniel only, it affects everybody who had any faith in anything or anyone. So it was non-specific. So if there was a court case, Daniel couldn't go and say, they're picking on me, because it is everybody. So they spread the net far and wide, knowing that the chief target, the chief prey is Daniel. So the ball was now in Daniel's court. How does he respond to this development? How is he going to play his hand? His response is absolutely worth noting. Daniel goes to work, but Daniel, one of the practices he had developed was to pray 3 times a day. Daniel's prayer life was a part of Daniel's life. Praying for him. Let me make some points here about Daniel and his prayer life. Prayer for him was never an option. It was a lifestyle. Praying for him was a personal matter that the public was privy to. I mean, the Bible does speak about praying in the closet. But Daniel is an exile, living in a foreign land, with his heart and his spirit back in Jerusalem. Scripture says he would open his windows towards Jerusalem because he was praying. I mean, the man was a Jew. He was praying for Jerusalem. He would bow down and he would pray 3 times a day, and everybody who passed could see Daniel. He had his definite, specific program, times of prayer. Prayer for Daniel was never optional. Prayer was an activity that he had cultivated and nurtured over time, so that it became a normal, regular, and predictable pattern. For Daniel, prayer was like breathing. Prayer for Daniel was a discipline he had developed and a value he had settled in his walk with God. Prayer for Daniel was non-negotiable with either king or kingdom. even when threatened or at risk, or even when his survival depended on it. Can I suggest to you, my brothers and sisters, that for Daniel, the position he took was not the position and would not be the position most, well, let me be generous, many of us would not adopt. Brothers and sisters, I don't know how many of you have, even when you read the passage, you would ever consider what it is like to be in a small room with a bunch of lions. Some of you saw a video of a misguided fellow teasing a lion somewhere in a zoo in St. Elizabeth, and the negotiation he had with the lion concerning his finger. And it's a negotiation that he lost. Well, can you imagine a threat like this? And Daniel had a predictable habit of praying 3 times a day in public, well, in private, but visible to the public. And this decree is announced. You know what the passage says? It says that when this decree was published, almost as if he was deaf, Daniel went up to his room, upstairs, opened the window as he always did, bowed on his knees as he always did, and prayed to God as he always did. Brothers and sisters, Daniel was not a smart man. He was not a smart man. You know, many of us, maybe even most of us, would have found a way to get out of it. Here are 2 options that I think some of us would have devised. We would have reasoned that, well, if we not pray regularly anywhere. No, I'm not saying we say that publicly, but you know, that is true. Not all of we pray all the while. Some of we remember to pray sometimes, but it has never been a cultivated habit for many of us. So a little 30-day break would be nothing out of the ordinary. We could survive, because not all of us pray every day at 6 o'clock in the morning or 5 o'clock in the morning, or we don't always do it. So the 30-day break, we could have managed, we could have survived. But for those of us who have prayer sometimes, here's the best one, which is the best alternative. We could pray in our hearts. Or we could pray in our minds. Or maybe using the kind of language of, contemporary spirituality, we could pray in our spirit. I like that one. The idea there is that we do this all the time. And not every time we really adopt a position of prayer. It's not all the time our lips move. It is not all the time we utter words. It's not all the time we bow our heads. Some of us pray with our eyes wide open. Some of us pray sitting down. Some of us, we are working at our desk or doing what we do. But you never hear somebody's testimony, and I whispered a prayer in my heart. So this kind of edict, can I suggest, wouldn't bother the majority of us. We could have lived in Babylon, we could have lived now in Persia, and the king could have made him edict both stop prayer, and we would have gone with life as if nothing happened. Because nobody know where to be no prayer warrior anywhere except in a church. And just like when COVID was going on, most of we never come to church anywhere. So nothing wouldn't happen. We would be fine. Not Daniel. Daniel had cultivated a prayer life, a prayer time, a prayer posture. Everybody knew that Daniel, regular, frequent, often. This was Daniel. So, as you know what the scripture says, when the edict was made, the last part of the 10th verse, Daniel just went upstairs to pray just as he had always done. Edict or no edict. His survival depended on it, on him obeying the edict. But as far as Daniel was concerned, king and kingdom will all pass away. But my commitment to God is non-negotiable and is not optional. Does this not remind you of two guys in Acts chapter 4 when they were told to stop preaching? Here verses 19 and 20. But Peter and John answered and said unto them, whether it be right in the sight of God to hearken to you more than God, judge ye. Choose, make up on the mind about that. For we cannot but speak the things which we have seen and heard. So if you want to check us in the temple. Because we now listen to you now. Even at the risk of threat or survival, your discipleship is never a matter for negotiation or compromise. That is what Daniel teaches. The question is, have we learned that? Daniel made no effort to hide his commitment to God. He made no effort to hide his life in God. And he made no effort to disguise his lifestyle. In fact, in continuing to be a follower of God, Daniel asserted his defiance. And not just his defiance, but his defiant rejection of all efforts to restrain him from worshiping and declaring his allegiance to God. It is what got him into trouble, you know. Why he was despised by his colleagues, and it was further going to get him into trouble with the king, who even though the king had liked him. When it was brought to the king's attention, you know the story. The poor king grieved, but him couldn't do nothing. His narcissism had caught up with him. They stoked his ego. They played into his hands. And now Daniel was caught. So Daniel ends up being thrown into the lion's den. But you know, brothers and sisters, one of the lessons that you can take from this and apply to your life, God will always have the last word. God will always have the last laugh. It doesn't matter how cleverly our plans are devised, God will always have the last word. Daniel spends the night. Well, Daniel is in the lion's den. The stone is rolled and the argument done. His detractors saying, finally got rid of him. Done with him. Next morning early the king runs. I know what he was expecting to hear. He goes and he calls out, Daniel, did your God deliver you? And perhaps the most surprised person in the world was the king, because a voice came back and said, I am here. And Daniel offers an explanation why he was there. Because the God I serve realized I was innocent and shut the lion's mouth. So I am fine. Which one of us would take that risk? That is a challenge. That is a challenge. Even at the risk of threat or survival, your discipleship is never a matter of negotiation or compromise. Daniel comes out of the den unscathed, unharmed, unhurt. But you know, Bob Marley wrote a song, and a part of it says, "Whosoever diggeth a pit." Well, I mean, I'm surprised at how them godly people know the Bob Marley music. Yes, whosoever diggeth a pit shall fall in it. Look what happened. The king ordered that the governors who devised it, who constructed it, they must be thrown into it. But not just them, their entire families. They had jeopardized and sacrificed their lives, the lives of their families, for their intent to destroy an innocent person. Brothers and sisters, God will always have the last word. So what lessons do we learn from this passage about Daniel? What is Daniel saying to us? He's saying this to us. You are who you are, irrespective of where you are. You are not to be like them if being like them is inconsistent with who you are in God. Secondly, it is your discipleship that must inform your disciplines, your habits, and your values. You don't have no floating morality. It is your discipleship that determines your values, that determines your habits, and that determines your disciplines. Third lesson, even at the risk of threat or survival, your discipleship is never a matter for negotiation or compromise. Challenges from the book of Daniel. My brothers and sisters, we're going to sing our closing hymn. And it's one that I am advised that you know. It's very simple. And it asks the question,